Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our regular meeting here. Thank you for coming along, and we're very fortunate that we're on live stream again tonight, and it'll be on YouTube later on as well. So I hope that you enjoy the topic in a few minutes, but before that, just to let you know about next month's meeting. It's on Thursday the 21st of August here, and the speaker will be Betty Hoop. She comes from Victoria, so we're fortunate to have an interstate speaker here again, and she's been here a number of times, and she'll be speaking about the German community in Mount Gambier. And when I first asked her about it, she was a bit hesitant because she thought she didn't know that much about it, but when she did some research, it was amazing how much information she found. So it'll be an interesting presentation, and she's unearthed a lot of information that we didn't know before, I think, and about the German population there, and also the early Lutheran church in Mount Gambier. Also, if anybody hasn't paid their subs, we encourage you to do so. See our treasurer down here, or people online who haven't paid yet, please do so. The money raised from that source is important to us. And if anybody else wants to become a member, either here or watching it live, you're most welcome to do so and see our treasurer again, and she'll be able to sort things out for you. If you haven't signed in tonight, please do so later on. I think otherwise things are running pretty smoothly in our organisation, and there's nothing major to report that I can think of at the moment. And so we'll head on to our topic tonight, and we welcome back John Strehlow. He's been here a number of times and been a presenter here, and we welcome you as well, and to any other visitors who are here. There's a few people I hadn't seen before, so are there any people here for the first time? Oh, well, look at them. Welcome, special welcome to you. And so if you want to see some of our publications and things around the place, just have a look, and you're most welcome to become more involved. So I hope you enjoy the evening's presentation as well. I'll call on Lyle Kupke to come forward and introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, John Strehlow, to you tonight. John is South Australian born and bred. He attended Adelaide Boys High School, University of Adelaide, where he studied classical languages and history. And from his early training in music, he developed an interest in theatre. So after spending some years in the Northern Territory, he moved to London, where he ran a theatre company which toured the UK and the continent for many years. In the 1990s, he returned to Australia on many occasions to research the life and work of his grandparents, Carl and Frieda Keysser. It was then that I met him at Lutheran Archives, as he carried out his research by investigating the records of the church and the Finke River Mission more thoroughly than anyone else has done before or since. The result, finally, was the publication of his book, The Tale of Frieda Keysser. And I see it out on the table out there in the foyer. This is a challenging book. It's a challenge to read because of its sheer size. But more importantly, it challenges our understanding and the understanding of all Australians of the importance of Carl and Frieda Strehlow to the Aboriginal people of Central Australia. It also demonstrates the value of these records that we have in Lutheran archives. And tonight, I expect John will challenge us again as he talks about his new book. So welcome, John.
It is switched on, yes. It's got the green light on. We've got the green light. That's more like it. I can hear that. I can hear the echo. That's what we want to hear. Now, as you can see, I've got that image up there, and that is, I'm sure, very well known to a lot of you as Lungmile Church, which is really where a lot of this mission stuff actually started, but not with that building, of course. And I did put out a little flyer in which I wrote, in preparation for this, that researching family history is a popular activity, but when I embarked on the Tale of Frieda Keysser, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. Thousands of letters turned up waiting to be read, and visits to archives in Central Europe soon followed. Investigating a forgotten past gives the inside story and a nuts and bolts outline of the 25-year project, ranging from how to do emergency repairs when your car's exhaust system falls off on a German motorway, to circumventing other family members' attempts to sabotage the project. Here and there, a skeleton turns up in the family closet. Now, this book is an easy read about an extraordinary venture with long-term lessons for Australia's future, and copies of the eBook are available. Now, I'd love to have the next slide, please. Can we get some action on this, please? It's nothing worse than having the technology messing up a whole talk. We need to get this thing happening. Well, look, I'm just going to carry on because we could sit here for half an hour. The next slide is meant to be a picture of a steam engine, and the steam engine is actually taken at Alice Springs, and it is, if you happen to be interested in such things, a picture of the Flying Scotsman. Now, you might ask yourself, why on earth would anybody who's researching this period of time have the slightest interest in putting up a slide of the Flying Scotsman? But the reason that I put it in is because I wanted in the book to try and get across to people in very uncertain terms the whole question. Can we get this sounds band? It's far too loud. This, I can hear, that's better, get it down. To get across to people the idea that this is something that we all really know about. If you look at that, you see the Flying Scotsman is this iconic steam engine which various people were foolish enough to think they wanted to try and renovate. And I think one person who was a very rich man at the time, when £20 million was a lot of money, managed to completely bankrupt himself. But the really important thing to realize is that in the period that I'm talking about, all this stuff was like luxury travel of the future. The stuff that I was dealing with all the time, and my grandparents were dealing with, was, of course, if we could have the next slide, please, it was this, they were moving everything with horse and buggy. Now, the horse and buggy is something that everybody thinks they know about because you see it a lot in American westerns and those sorts of American films. They've always got horses and buggies, and they're always careering out of control. This is really bad. Is it possible to get this thing happening really properly? Because it's just ruining the whole talk. Just And horse and buggy from Tanunda to Hermannsburg on one journey that the grandparents made was 28 days. Now, I don't believe there are many places in the world today that would take 28 days to get there. And I think that when you sort of realize the terrific limitations that the horse and buggy had and how travel was really arduous and often really quite dangerous, it means that you can get some idea of just how difficult it was for people to actually live up there. I don't think many people today have any idea of what it was like. This is, by the way, meant to be a slide taken at Palm Valley, if you happen to know that part of the world. Now, the thing that struck me when I was working on this whole thing was that I thought at the beginning that essentially everything was known. You know, there had been this book, Hermannsburg, A Vision and a Mission, which I personally think is an excellent publication, but it's very much sort of sketchy. It doesn't really cover all the big issues. Nonetheless, I found it very good, and most of the information was in it was reliable. So that was a great start. However, I wasn't really bothered at the beginning because there was so much stuff published about this family that it seemed to me that, you know, I was the person who really didn't know. People referred vaguely to various things my father had done in some part of Central Australia where they nearly died of thirst. And then they talked about all sorts of other things about, especially, you know, Spencer and Gillen and how remarkable they were, etc., etc. And I just felt that, you know, I was, in a way, somebody totally unqualified to even do this. And I knew I had to start somewhere, so I thought, well, let's go to the Lutheran Archives. And of course, when I got to the Lutheran Archives, I very quickly asked for the Fink River Mission file, which is just a great pile of letters stacked up like that. And I went through these things and I noted that there were various letters which had been put on a brass spike, as they used to do in the good old days when they didn't bother with filing systems. Just read the letter, put it on the brass spike, and bang, there you've got it until you want to look at it again. The problem was that the letters I was looking for were all dated 1891, 1892, 1893, and some of the letters were actually, well, you know, brass spikes don't rust, but they do form verdigris, and the verdigris was now anchoring these letters, so I had to be extremely careful disentangling them, or I'd just rip the letter in half. Now, I knew, because I was at that stage so deeply immersed into this whole thing, I knew that there was going to be a problem with the letters having arrived wet, and that therefore probably what had happened was the letters had arrived wet because the male horses, pack horses mainly, but also the male buggy, had to go through flooded rivers because there were very, very heavy rains in that part of the world at that time. So all the mail arrived absolutely soaking wet. Fortunately, they used Indian ink, so it was indelible. And they would just put the thing on the brass spike, and then it would slowly rust. And it meant, of course, to me, which was an absolutely astonishing thing, that though there was so much written by all sorts of people, nobody had looked at these letters for 100 years. You think of that. For a whole century, not one person had disentangled them. And that's why they were, as it were, rusted to this brass spike. Now, well, at first I was rather fascinated by this because, you know, it was like some treasure trove out of the past, something that got into a time warp and somebody locked the door and never come back. And because I have this theatrical background, of course, you know, those sorts of things are always very interesting because so many plays are designed around that sort of phenomenon. So it didn't really bother me too much about it. Not all the letters, however, had been written and got rusty to the spike. But the number of letters I found in the Lutheran Archives were absolutely astronomical. And I've just taken out of the book just a list of some of the letters. And I write that they were either just a lot or they were copious. And the ones that were really copious, well, I'll go through the whole lot. John Bogner, who is probably, you know the name Bogner, copious letters from him. A man called Nicole Wettengel, which you may not have heard of, but if you read my book, you would have, also copious. Otto Siebert, not particularly a huge number. Adolf Ortenburger, who was up at Appala, I think, for years and years. Friedrich Leidig, of course, who would be known to you, copious. J.G. Reuter, copious letters from him. I mean, this man just turned off letters one after the other. Then there was Johannes Fliel, enormous numbers from him and his nephew, Johannes Fliel II. G.J. Rechner, who probably you know of if you're interested in mission history. Ludwig Keibel, copious. J.J. Stolz, copious. Adolf Heinrich, Johannes Riedel, Oscar Liebler, copious again, etc. And there were also a few letters from somebody called Harry Hillier, who you may not have heard of, but it was a teacher from England. And of course there were workmen such as Ernst Graetz, Ernst Jacob, Hermann Vogelsang, and Gerhard Johansen. And all of these things were vital to my story. So as you can imagine, I got sort of completely buried under a mass. And I did really wonder at one stage how I would ever manage to sort of, well, get to grips with this thing and actually produce a book. But it's really because there was so much correspondence to go through and annotate and to sort of work out who was relevant or not, that the book did actually take the 25 years that it did. Now, I think the next slide, if we could have that one, please. Yes, that's the one there. That is the book that I produced. That's Frieda there, and it, as you can see, it says Volume 1, 1875 to 1910. So that was the first half, and 1,250 pages. Now, you know, I had started off, as I say, thinking I'd be struggling to produce a book of, say, well, even 300 pages. And here I was on 1,250 pages and only halfway through the job. Now, I realized while I was working on this that Frieda was a terrifically important person, not just for my story, because she'd kept a diary, and people who keep diaries, I mean, there should be a special place in heaven for people who keep diaries, because it's the only way that we're ever going to really know anything. But it wasn't that, it was the fact that she had been very influential in changing the infant mortality statistics, and I'll probably go into that in a minute a little bit more. And so I then started to look at her family, and what happened was that I realized that before everyone else, I'd had an uncle, and he'd produced this tiny little book, which is, of course, you know, the family tree of the Keysers. Not the Strehlows. The Strehlows just get tucked in at the end as a sort of an afterthought. But it's pages and pages of stuff and terrifically complicated stuff. If we could have the next slide, please. And the family tree had been worked out by one of my father's brothers. Oh dear, we're still at the stage of not getting the things up. And it'll come up in a minute. And I did quite a lot of work on it because, amongst many other things, I was busy looking for a lost relative. Those of you who have done this sort of work will know that there are always lost people. I mean, he was described in the text as verschollen, which, you know, is one of those terms that's often used for soldiers who disappeared on the battlefield and they never found a body. Anyway, I sort of decided I wanted to do the thing properly, and I decided to look at the place where Frieda, oh dear, this is hopeless, where there was this, yes, that's the one there. Now, if you look at that, you can see that that is actually quite a substantial set of buildings, and there was this whole idea that there had been a fortune, a lost fortune, and that this family had been really very, very rich, and that somehow or other they had been diddled out of this fortune. Now, I think if you've ever done this sort of stuff, you'll know that most families do actually have some such story. There's the story that, you know, we would be staying in the Hilton, we would be flying first class to Milan on shopping trips, we would own this, we would have that, but somehow or other along the line we got diddled. And it's all very unfair, and people spend whole lifetimes lamenting this situation. And that was the situation, interestingly, with my father and his siblings. He was one of 6 children, 5 boys and 1 daughter, and they all assured me that there had been a fortune there, but this fortune had somehow or other, well, it had been taken away from them by dubious means, let's put it that way. So anyway, I decided, having done that, I would then try to sort of, well, track that story down, because it seemed to me that if Frieda did come from a family where there had really been a big wheel, and even a big wheel in a small village, even, you know, a big fish in a small village pond, if you're the big fish, it's pretty good, isn't it? It's when you're the little fish in the big pond, that's when it's not so good. And of course, somebody said to me at one stage, well, you know, that means that she would have had very high expectations of her. And I must say that I think that was one of the truest observations anybody made. If you come from a family like that, when you're growing up and you're playing with all the other children, your mother probably, or somebody will say, well, of course, it's okay for those children because they're such and such, but for you, that's not good enough. And I think that was a key factor in Frieda's story. And what I was so staggered by was that nobody in the family, let's just say my first cousins essentially, had ever realized that this would be the case. They didn't actually think that Frieda would have had high expectations. They didn't actually think that she would have had to have, you know, adhered to a code of behavior which was quite different from everybody else's. So I found that a very useful thing, and I had to try and factor that in, because it seemed to me that almost she lived in a different world from all her children, and perhaps also from all the other people that were in her life. And if I therefore went through, if we could have another slide, if it will come up, even if it won't, let's have it. Yes, now see, that is the family tree that was drawn up. And then we could have the next slide after that too. And this is my work. I was busy trying to track down people, you see. So I wrote this all in up there because I found an awful lot of stuff by going through the records of the gymnasium. I'm sure you know that the gymnasium is a grammar school in German. It's not a gymnasium at all. They do practice things like, well, gymnastics, but essentially it's a grammar school. And I knew that a lot of the family had gone there because it was one of those grammar schools, I think, set up in 1648. So I was able to track through, because I wanted to establish, did she really come from an old family? I mean, when you say an old family, you mean a good old family. I mean, all families are the same age, really. We're all descended from whatever we're descended from. But most people don't have records. But in Frieda's family's case, they really did. And they really had had an influence. And when I say they had an influence, they were especially influential when they died. When they died, the government sent a representative to the funeral just to make sure that everybody knew that they were sort of paying their due respects to this important family. So again, you see, the Frieda aspect of it became sort of increasingly important for me. Now, obviously, one of the reasons why Frieda was important for me was the fact that she left these very extensive diaries. And when I say extensive, I mean thousands of pages, handwritten, and kept some her daughter threw away, I think, because they had negative references to her. But most of them are there, and all the period, those from the period of the mission, they were all intact. So, of course, it was a fantastic source of information. And, of course, it was there that one started to notice all sorts of differences between the, what you might call the received or the standard version of the whole, especially the Hermannsburg thing, but especially also of Frieda, because all sorts of things were notated which probably didn't seem very important when she notated them, but when you read them 100 years later, they have a very different impact. So anyway, getting back to this thing of Frieda and infant mortality, I don't know how much you're aware of the fact that in the 19th century, the whole scientific world was basically hit by a train, and the train was Darwin's theory. And when we talk about Darwin's theory, you know, today it's almost assumed that everything Darwin said and thought was right, but it's not actually the case that one would think that today, one would think that then. I mean, basically, it demolished the whole idea of Adam and Eve in the garden. All that stuff was just out the window. Suddenly, human beings were seen to have evolved over an immense period of time. And of course, there had been various earlier races which had completely died out, as it was put. And of course, it was therefore assumed by all sorts of people that, in fact, the Aboriginal population was just a primitive race that should have died out had there been other human beings around, because they were so primitive and they were so unable to adapt that they wouldn't be able to, as it were, survive really into the 20th century. I remember some very famous author in Australia, and I won't say who I think it was, because when I tried to find it, I couldn't actually check it against his work, but he said, the tragedy of the Australian Aborigines is that they survived into the 20th century. Now, you think of that. If they think that they're surviving at all is a tragedy, you can imagine what the people who just hated them anyway, what they really thought. So Frieda's big role was in reversing infant mortality. Now, I had never heard anybody mention any of this, and I don't think anybody has taken me up on it. I think people basically really couldn't care. And especially this applies to the anthropologists who are really only interested in theories, and they seemingly have no interest at all in somebody who sets out to stop the little babies dying. I mean, obviously, if all the children die, then that's the end of the race. It's that simple. You don't need to do a PhD to work that one out. So she managed to reverse that situation, and she went into why this was. Now, for me personally, it was really at this point I started to realize that what I was working on was something which was absolutely going to change the whole face of anthropology, if people listen to it, of course. I mean, so far I don't think anybody in anthropology that I know of is really very interested. They pay lip service and say, oh yes, that's all very well, but you know, it's not very important. Well, if you think that all the children dying is not important, then I really think you should seek psychological help before it's too late. If all the children die, then that is a major disaster. And somebody who reverses that is somebody who's played a major role. And as I say, it was really at this point that I started to realize how important Frieda was, and it was one of the reasons why I called the book The Tale of Frieda Keysser. Various people said to me, no, you can't do that. You should call her The Tale of Frieda Strehlow. But I wanted to make it The Tale of Frieda Keysser because I wanted her to be seen in her own right as a person who made a real contribution which was really of inestimable value. And what was so odd was that the people who insisted that the population was doomed were very often people with high medical qualifications. I mean, Professor Stirling, as he was, Professor, I suppose he was Sir Edward Stirling, wasn't he? I think he was a Sir. He was one of those people. He used, before coming on that trip with, what was it? I think it was Governor Kintore, was it, coming down from the south, from the north, sorry, by horse and dray, or horse and buggy. He ran a hospital in London before he came back to Australia. Pretty sure of that. And here he is saying, oh, well, you see, they're a doomed race. They have no future. Now, all these people endorsed this thing. And, of course, by coming across this stuff, of course, it put me in conflict with an enormous, well, really with everybody. Because everybody assumed that the Darwinist teachings of the Darwinist ideas was pretty much unchallengeable. I mean, I can only say I don't want you to think I'm a creationist. I don't know and all that stuff. I don't doubt that we did evolve, and we did start, you know, something started from you know, an ape-like creature, and that there were various races like, you know, the Homo habilis and then the Homo erectus and then the Neanderthals. But I don't really think that explains very much. I mean, at the moment, in our scientific world, we have a situation in which people are, as far as we know, not finding any other source of life anywhere else in the universe with, what, millions of stars and millions of planets. And I think, have we really actually understood what we think we have? I mean, or were we just at a very primitive level in our scientific thinking? I mean, I would say that is almost undeniable. I mean, can you imagine it? Millions of stars, millions of planets, and just one planet in the whole universe that we know for sure has sentient beings, let's call it that, i.e. us and the animals and the birds and the trees. I mean, if you think of it, it's a real challenging thought. And of course, it was at that point that I suppose I started to feel, well, very cautious about accepting all the claims that were made in Darwinist thinking. Now, I want to sort of move on for that and just point out to you that the topic of Darwin's work, the origin of species by means of natural selection, that's the word we all know, but there's a subtitle to that, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, of course, that was taken in the 19th century as, if you like, giving a green light to us wiping out the Aboriginal population, which we did fairly effectively. It's the preservation of favored races, i.e. we're the favored race, they were the unfavored race, and it was inevitable that they would die out. Now, I just want to move on to the next slide, if we can. That's just a quick one which just shows the family Frieda came from. This is well, they used to have, for the funeral services, they would have the whole service bound and they would put down what they called a Lebenslauf, by which they meant basically an account of the life of this person. And that dates from one of Frieda's forebears. And it's really ancient German, by the way. I mean, I'm sure some of you could understand it better than me, but it says what the sermon was about, the three pillars of the faith, and it quotes from Job. I know that my Redeemer lives is the word that we use in the hymn, and it's of the former worthy and very honourable Mrs. Elizabeth née Drexel. If you're familiar with German, you'll note that she's a Drexelin. They put the feminine ending on the surname. Of Mr. George Kaiser, the former amazing, it's all about how marvellous he was. And down there she's described as the Witwe, by which of course we mean the widow. She'd be a Witwe in modern German. And that's dated 1669, so that's when she lived. So Frieda did actually really come from a family that was, well, they thought they were marvellous. I mean, I don't know how marvellous they really were, but of course they were busy making steel, or they were making iron actually. And governments, as you know, are always very interested in people who make iron, because of course you need iron if you've got a situation of peace. You know, remember in those days, they didn't have rubber tires on all the wagons. They had a steel ring holding all that woodwork together, otherwise the wheels would have just fallen apart. But also in war, you also need steel for weaponry. So, of course, those people would have been considered important just for that reason alone. If you're producing iron, the government wants to know about you. They want to know what you're doing, and they want to see you flourishing. If we could have the next slide, please. Now, this is just, this is, of course, from before the period of photography. So this man, I think, died in 1822, so that's, I suppose it's an engraving. But those sorts of things turned up in connection with Frieda's family. You know, you can see he is a clergyman, I mean, of course, and, you know, he's Augustus, it would be Augustus Friedrich Ruprecht, and I think he's born sometime about 1764. So this was the sort of family that I did managed to find. And what was interesting is that Frieda herself had preserved a lot of these things. I don't know where she got them from, but, well, who knows? She got them from somewhere, and she did a huge amount of work, and probably quite a lot of her research is actually in this, though it isn't stated that it's from her, but I suspect it was, because she wrote up the sort of life histories of all her forebears, especially the women. And if you've ever done this sort of work, you'll know it's very difficult to actually get information about the women because nobody normally writes about them. And she sat down and copied all that by her hand. If we could have the next slide, please. Now, this is Darwin, of course, and I put him up here because I think he's such an important person for my story. And if we could have the next page. Now, this, you see, is the German version, which Carl, let's say my grandfather's, he was sort of his co-worker, I suppose you say. He edited Carl's manuscripts, and that's just the title of Darwin in German, and massively influential. Today, we don't even really think about how influential it was. Today, we think, oh, well, yes, Darwin, and we've got a city in Australia called Darwin, which has lots of problems, et cetera, but that's about all. I don't think we really rate it, but it did have a massive, massive effect. And of course, that was really why the missionaries were sort of so out of favor, and I think are still, because it was, although they claim that Darwin himself didn't imply that all these tribal peoples were doomed to die out, everybody else absolutely assumed that. And they did use Darwin to justify their view, and they'd say, you see, he's listed all these tribes, which are all these different types of human being, how they all died out. The Aborigines will die out as well. Okay, if we could have the one after that now, please. Now, this is probably one of the single most important publications in this area in Australia ever. It is, of course, the first translation of the New Testament. And it's translated into diary, of course, which is where Carl was. And as you could see, there's J.G. Reuter, who I called out before, and C. Strehlow. And they're the translators. And that, as you can see, I think it's 1897, that's right. Now this has been more or less completely passed over. And again, this is what happened while I was working on the book. I'd come across things and I think, this is terrifically important. And nobody could care less. That's what amazed me. I thought, how can it possibly be that nobody notices this? Because prior to that publication, various people, missionaries, had tried to translate the New Testament into these languages, and they'd got some of the stuff done. They'd got the Gospels, and they might have got a bit of Revelation. I think they got some of that. They found the letters extremely difficult, probably because their linguistic skills were not up to it. And I don't know of anybody other than me who thinks this thing is even important. So you had all these arguments about how these primitive people were completely unable to have any sorts of ideas in their head. Their heads were really, well, pretty empty, actually. And they couldn't possibly understand the gospel. It's far, far above their heads. And so you get this situation where somebody says, but in point of fact, their languages are not as primitive as everybody thought. They are not primitive languages. Now, I can't go into that in detail, but if you know anything about my father's work, you'll know that he would sort of work himself into a state of absolute frenzy if anybody used the word savages. He thought that was the one thing he hated. They were always savages. And here it was, you see, that the New Testament actually translated into the local language. And of course, Carl then did another one for Aranda. And of course, from now on, really as a result, I think, of his work, people are doing it in all sorts of languages in Central Australia, but that was all a long way down the track, not in his lifetime. So that is a really important document, which I think, I mean, why it has been completely omitted from well, all the accounts, I think, is really due to the fact that people are virulently anti-Christian, even if they pretend that they're not. They don't want to find that the Christians got it right, and so they will not allow that they were wrong on these primitive languages. Now, if we can have the next slide, please. The other area where Carl was really significant, and again, it amazes me that nobody is interested in this, but I say it seems as if I wouldn't describe myself as a voice crying in the wilderness, but perhaps a little bit like that. This is a page from Carl's famous work, Die Arende und Lurische Stämme in Zentralaustralien, which I mainly refer to as DALS, because the name is far too long, you can't keep repeating that. So I just refer to it as DALS, D-A-U-L-S. And that is his work, his translation of the chanting. Now, again, I don't know how much you've come across the writings of Spencer and Gillen, but some of you surely must have, and you'll know that they, and for that matter also Hermann Kemper, with all due respect to Bob, they all said these chants were in an indecipherable language, and that it was gibberish. It may have meant something once, but it didn't mean anything now. Now, Carl, you see, again, predictably, just as he got the sort of New Testament translation thing done, he then got into this, and he, of course, provided a translation of this gibberish, and he explained that it was all, how can I say it? Well, I always use the word enciphered, although most people might call it encrypted. But the enciphered means that if you hear it, you won't understand what it means. And in the case of these sort of ceremonies, which we hear so much about, the secret, sacred ones, it meant that men would have to learn this stuff off by heart so that they could perform the ceremonies, but they didn't know what they were chanting. I mean, it's an immensely sophisticated thing. They'd learn all these chants, and they'd have to get the syllables right. They couldn't get them wrong, but they didn't know what they meant. Only a few, the inner circle, as it were, they would know them. Now, if we can have the next slide, you'll see that this is from my father's work, and that's his book, Songs of Central Australia. And Songs of Central Australia, of course, he goes essentially into the chants, into what he calls a verse, and he goes into what it is in the encrypted form, and then he goes into the prose form, and then he goes into the translation of it into English. And as you can see, there's a direct correspondence there between his father's work and his own work. I got into this because I had to, in my book, try and sort of steer clear of talking too much about TGH, because what I found very early in the piece was that nobody wanted to know about Carl Strehlow, or just a few did, and absolutely nobody wanted to know about Frieda at all. So I was there, you know, sort of trying to bash my head against the brick wall, which is, I suppose, a very bad idea. But I did feel that it was important that I stressed that TGH, as I refer to him, his work was essentially grew out of his father's. He always represented himself as a, if you like, the man who started it all, who came from nowhere, a bit like Venus coming up out of the sea, you know, in that famous painting. And of course, it's complete nonsense. He is absolutely 100% founded on his own father's work. And of course, I got into this whole business of, you know, what did the father say, and what did the son say, and what was this? I mean, I tried to stay out of that because I think it's a labyrinth. You'll never, ever actually escape from it. You can get into these sorts of arguments very easily, but you're very unlikely to get out of them. Anyway, that just gives you some idea of what I was doing. And of course, all of this, again, was casting a sort of an enormous sort of, well, if you like, a hot light, really a spotlight almost, but more than just a spotlight, flooding with light a situation where people really just sat and thought, well, we don't really know what this is really all about. We don't know who did this. We don't know who's responsible for what. Anyhow, I did go into that quite a lot. And all the time, you see, I'm sitting there thinking, but I don't really know anything about all this stuff. I mean, I don't speak these languages. Yes, I do. I have a fair grip on German, but I don't know an Aboriginal language. I never had much to do with the people there anyway. The people I mainly had to do with were, in fact, people in the Flinders Ranges, the so-called Adnyamatna. I had quite a lot to do with them, but with the Aranda, not really. So I was a bit hesitant. See, I spent the whole time thinking, have I really got the qualifications to be dealing with this stuff? And I thought, well, there's not much good saying I have or I haven't. I need to try and get to grips with it. And if I can, well and good. And if I can't, well, that's sort of very unfortunate. Now, if we could have the next slide, please. Now, this, for me, I think, was one of the biggest, well, surprises, but, you know, a very positive surprise. It's these letters. When I first was going through all this stuff, it's all in the Strehlow Research Centre in Alice Springs, which is basically barred to all researchers now, for reasons that I can't go into and don't really know why. I can guess. These letters were written to the Strehlows when they went to Germany to take their children back to get their education. And this letter, it's basically, well, we'll come to the next slide. Maybe we should look at the next slide. I mean, you can't probably read it, but I can read a bit of it out to you. And this is written by, well, it's a joint letter from somebody called Andreas, who was one of the first two people baptized. It was Thomas and it was Andreas. And I think Andreas had gone to school and learned how to write. And Silas, or Silas as I would call him, but I think in German they would call him Silas, he would have been too old to go to school and so probably couldn't read or write. So anyhow, it's dated 18th November 1910, is it? Yes, it should be 10, yes. And it's addressed to Hermannsburg in the land of Germany. And it's Mr. Strehlow, my dear friend, I want to say, how are you? I want to ask you, my friend, are you well? What about your wife and your children? I've had a headache and also heart disease. I was ill and now I'm healthy again. Mr. Strehlow, when will you return? I'm longing for you and waiting for you from now and always, my friend. One person died whose name was Muniatja. This was the nephew of Joseph and Nathaniel's father. I want to see your face again, my friend, when you come here. Then I will be happy, my dear friend, when you return. And then below that, I, Silas, am now writing to you, Mr. Strehlow. I was ill when you left and now I'm better. I want you to return, my friend. I'm Silas or Silas, and I'm your friend Andreas. And as I say, I think the letter was written by Andreas. It's all in the same handwriting. And then there's another one, and this is from Nathaniel, who was one of the key figures. I mean, the Strehlows thought this man was absolutely marvellous. To my friend, Mr. Strehlow, we received your letter today and we haven't forgotten you both. I thank you that you lived here at Hermannsburg. Many of the men are plastering houses. For a while they will be plastering the house of Mr. Münchenberg. We're waiting for you continually and keep asking about you because we want to see your faces again, and after that we will be happy. Here I take the services twice on Sunday in the church. Mr. Lieber once because he's going to Alice Springs. Moses is teaching the children in the school. Men are breaking rocks and making mud. I am your friend, Nathaniel. Now, if you've come across very much anthropological writing, you will know that it's absolutely littered with the idea that here these poor people are being put upon by these terrible missionaries who are ruining their lives and ruining their ancient customs and destroying everything. If you come across a letter like that, it means you could basically put most of that stuff straight through the shredder, just get rid of it. It's absolute, unadulterated rubbish, and it's all dreamt up by people who haven't been there, who don't know these people, who haven't investigated it properly. I don't know if you're aware, but in the 18th century, the French kings used to make wonderful furniture out of paper mache. And I've always thought with a lot of this writing, you could put an awful lot of it through the shredder, you could make it into paper mache, you could make a fortune actually. You've got a huge reservoir of this material, which you could just basically turn into something useful, and it would probably be the first time that it's ever been of any use to anybody. So anyway, those letters, if we could have the next one, I mean, these are all the letters in the Strehlow Research Centre. I think something like 50 all told, and they keep digging up more, and they're all basically written either to Carl or to Frieda. Some of them are written by Carl to Frieda, because when they were in Germany, or even in this country, when they were corresponding with postcards, remember, postcards were much cheaper to send, they would write it all in Aranda, so nobody knew what they were saying. It's all full of these sort of these silly things that fond husbands and wives say to each other. I don't know why they do, but they do it. They continue to think that, you know, the world of each other, or some of them do. The lucky ones do. The not so lucky ones don't. But they did this. But most of those letters are, in fact, written by the people, especially to them when they're in Germany. And it's very clear to me, as I was working on, that the only reason they came back from Germany was because of those letters. Because, you see, Frieda was very keen to leave Hermannsburg in 1910. I think she thought, I've done my stint. I've been here since 1895. I've been through all the droughts and the heat waves and the terrible food. Now I can sort of go back to Germany and have a proper life, because she always wanted to be basically a clergyman's wife and have a clergyman's existence. And Carl was offered a job. Well, his relatives, who were very influential, said all he had to do was to apply for the job and he would get it. Then these letters appeared, and they had their effect. The people at Hermannsburg were terribly worried about what was being done, partly by Keibel, the chairman of the board, who came up and wanted to change everything. And they probably sensed the fact that Spence was very keen to shut down Hermannsburg. So they're all writing these letters, some of them only just a few lines, some of them quite substantial. And that's what swung it. And Carl eventually, because it was Frieda's aunt, this Aunt Augusta, I mean, you call her Augusta and you think of Lady Bracknell, but she was actually really, well, she was always referred to as Gusti, and Tante Gusti. And she was the one who thought that it was time that they came back to Germany. And Carl, on receiving these letters, he went and explained to her, we can't possibly do this. We can't start something here and then dump them and leave it, because he knew that the place would be shut down. So those letters are hugely significant. Hugely significant. I think they actually turned the whole thing around. Now, I just want to talk very briefly. How much time have I had? I think I'm sort of coming up on my limit, aren't I? I'll just refer briefly to the fact that I did come across lots of contradictions between my father and his father, and some of them were quite considerable. One of them was this whole business of whether they believed that there was a God in the sky, which he did confirm, and what it was like up in the sky, because it's so close to the idea of the Christians having a place in the sky, which is a heaven, and it's solid. You know, the streets of heaven are paved with gold. You don't pave the streets with gold unless they're solid. I just wanted to briefly point that out. There was a big sort of disagreement or difference of opinion there. And what was interesting, they used the same informants. That's to say, they referred to people that Carl had used, my father used. Now, I think I should leave it there, because that's good, and I'd like to thank you for listening.
Any questions from anybody? Yeah, just a minute. I'll get everybody to speak in the microphone so that for the recording we can hear it.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great talk. I think you're absolutely right about the humanisation of the relationships between Frieda and Carl and the Aboriginal people. That is kind of a taboo thing to talk about, I think, amongst in academic circles and things like that, because we have to imagine things were terrible then, and in the 1960s and 70s we became enlightened. But I think there's this humanisation between the Indigenous people and some of the early settlers. With regards to Francis and Gillen, is it not true that Spencer for example, was having to listen to Fraser in England and the Darwinists. Gillen may have shared more with Frieda than we may be aware of. His relationships were humanised, and that went into the Spencer and Gillen works, even though it had this gloss of Darwinism because of Baldwin's link with Fraser and the people in London. So it might not be a strict binary between the relationships that Frieda had been humanised and Spencer and Gillen being these people who advocated the doom race theory. There was a tension within the works of Spencer and Gillen, and specifically the way in which Gillen humanised that relationship, and the Aranda people entrusted him and would bring stories to him and bring artefacts to him. And I think that makes Spencer and Gillen's works quite valuable if we remove the kind of Darwinian gloss that was often put there, and that we might see that there's more affinity between Frieda and Carl and Spencer and Gillen, particularly Gillen, than you've mentioned.
Well, I don't want you to think that I write off the works of Spencer and Gillen, because I don't. I see it this way. I think that Gillen was the real brains, you see. I don't think that Spencer was, well, I don't think he was really terribly intellectual. What he was very good at doing was putting material together in books that looked very good and read very well. And I think that was his real talent. I did go into the whole business of that, and it seemed to me that originally the book was actually going to be just Gillen. And it was Gillen who insisted that Spencer's name be included. And of course, because Spencer had these Oxbridge connections, therefore, of course, everybody in England thought, oh, it's really all Spencer. But I think that's completely wrong. I think Fraser is quite wrong on that. I think that the book is essentially Gillen, and I do think Gillen was probably, well, because he started from a background when nobody really was writing anything very important at all, I think it's arguable, because anybody, you know, the great German expression, aller Anfang ist schwer, it's really hard to start something. It's really difficult. And I mean, I sort of feel that myself with trying to change ideas which are so ingrained, and everybody believes them. And I think, therefore, you know, it's arguable that Gillen was the greatest researcher of all time. I mean, in Australia, I don't know about other countries because I don't try to talk about them, but in Central Australia, I think it was so difficult for him to, as it were, well, I don't know who he would talk to, you see. Who would he talk to? Well, he talked to the men. He obviously thought when these old men wandered, he obviously went, oh, it's over the moon, it's in his letters. You read his letters, you can see he's absolutely ecstatic. So-and-so came in today and we did this and he gave me that, and you think, this is a man who's absolutely on the same wavelength. But Spencer, I don't, well, as I say, I give him credit for firstly discovering Gillen, because nobody else did. Because Gillen was an Irish Catholic who'd left school as a little boy, or young, not even really as an adult, not even as an adolescent, if what we are told is correct. But I think that Spencer has been massively overrated. That doesn't make him an idiot. I think he's just somebody who's in the grip of fashionable theories, and fashionable theories, they're just everywhere, and they're really destructive. Anybody else?
Okay, any other questions anywhere? You must have done such a good job. I'll call on Ev Leske to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you, John. I just want to take you to Wednesday in the Lutheran Archives volunteers room. It was chock-a-block with researchers and workers. 1, 2, 3, I think there were 6 of us. And we're all enjoying our time. And there's this bookcase alongside, which is our go-to. There's Latin dictionaries and lots of German dictionaries and Bibles and other authoritative material. And right there on the top shelf is the Tale of Frieda Keysser, 3 volumes. John, your work is really starting to make an impression, and I think it's not just someone who reads the whole of that work. It's so easy to dip into little sections and draw out critical pieces of information from that. And if you've seen the book, it's got wonderful reference material at the back, timelines and stuff like that. Why am I talking about that book? Because it's a new book that John's been producing, investigating a forgotten past. It's because this new book, it gives a personal spin, just as we've heard today, a personal spin on the story of Frieda and the work in Central Australia. And that's what makes it a different book and a good read. I've read it and I enjoy it. I enjoyed it. I especially enjoyed a chapter when John described a tour he went on through the Aboriginal lands there with Glen Ulrich. And I'm sure a lot of those of you who have been up in that central area and worked up there, you would enjoy it, and I certainly did, even though I've never worked up there. It's that kind of personal, relational story that makes this new book a bit different, but really interesting to read. One other thing, I can quote 3 words that from the book that you'll appreciate, and those 3 words are the indefatigable Lois Sweck. We all know Lois in this gathering, and John obviously picked that up from all his research at Lutheran Archives. Thank you for all your work, and we wish you all the best with your new book. It comes up very nicely on eBook, on your computer or your iPad or whatever. The pages turn nicely, so it's a little bit like a real book. And I appreciated that. So we do have something to thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll break the habit of a lifetime and sample these with relish.
Thank you.
I did also want to say that if you are interested in getting the e-book at the moment, you can only get it off me, but I can organise that for you tonight. I've got some forms so that if you want to fill in your email address, which is what I'll need, and your name, then we can do that some other time, or we can do it now, but probably it's best to actually only organise the selling of the book. Having a solid book, of course, you could all have a look through it, but I just decided I was talked into this, and I think it might have been the indefatigable Lois Sweck who swung the balance for me. Anyhow, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for this.
Thank you. So there's a challenge for you to enrol and read an e-book.
Yes, that's right. It works on the computer. It works on my computer. If it works on my computer, it'll work on anybody's.
Okay, so as you came in here tonight, you would have seen a table out here with some books on it, the Frieda Keysser books and some others. And I think our man Ben Hollister, is he awake? Yep. See Ben to purchase any of those books. That sound right? Good, he nodded yes. So, and the other one that we're talking about is an e-book. So, thank you for coming here tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope our visitors who are here for the first time enjoyed it as well. You're all welcome to join us for supper over in the church hall. Have a look at the books out there, and just keep an eye out for our next meeting, which is up on the screen now, August the 21st, when Betty Hook was giving a talk about significant people in the Mount Gambier district. So thank you, and safe travelling home, and tomorrow night it might be a bit different weather-wise.